Hello, good day, and welcome to this session on selecting and managing new suppliers. By the end of this session, we should be able to understand supplier pre-qualification, lay the foundation for selecting suppliers in the public sector, and identify the benefits of appraising and appraisal feedback to suppliers in relationship management. So supplier pre-qualification basically refers to the process of defining and assessing a criteria for supplier suitability so that only pre-screened suppliers who have certain minimum standards of capability, capacity, and compatibility are invited or considered for participation in a given sourcing process. So basically, supplier pre-qualification refers to establishing a criteria that will be used to ascertain whether suppliers are competent enough for the organization to deal with, or whether the suppliers are competent enough for the organization to include on their approved supplier list. So the purpose of pre-qualification is to ensure that a potential supplier, the key word being a potential supplier, will be able to perform any contracts or tender that it is awarded to the required standard. So there are certain reasons why organizations may undertake supplier pre-qualification exercise. One of them being to prepare an approved supplier list, where they wouldn't have to engage in any rigorous pre-qualification process, but they want to prepare an approved supplier list such that as and when they require an item, they would refer to that list because it has suppliers who are competent and capable enough to undertake that activity. And then its pre-qualification may also be conducted on a procurement specific basis, meaning as and when they require an item, depending on the nature of item that they want, the organization will conduct pre-qualification to identify suppliers who are suitable and capable of executing the procurement activity. And it is also done to embed qualitative selection criteria in the selection of suppliers because pre-qualification helps you to establish a criteria that will be used to evaluate suppliers. It helps you to identify or include some of these criteria to be able to analyze suppliers' capability, competence, in addition to the other financial metrics which are more quantitative in nature. Then move on to supplier appraisal. Supplier appraisal refers to the process of assessing the capability and suitability of suppliers prior to negotiation or other processes for supplier selection and contract award. So you can see supplier appraisal as something that follows supplier pre-qualification. So pre-qualification after pre-qualification, organizations come up with an approved supplier list, and they are then required to conduct supplier appraisal to establish the capability of the suppliers that they want to do business with, whether they have the financial standing, whether they have the rigor that is required to undertake the procurement that the organization wants to embark on. It should be noted that supplier appraisal is a time consuming process and therefore it should be applied when the organization is sourcing for strategic and items which are not standardized because it requires rigor in determining these capability and suitability. We have certain tools that are used for supplier appraisal which will be discussed subsequently. Okay, so in appraising suppliers, Ray Carter has propounded these 10 C's as a criteria that organizations can use in assessing the supplier's capability and competence. So the first C, which is competence, is where you have to determine whether the supplier can produce the type of items that you require or deliver the services that you require. You would have to determine whether they have the innovation, design, as well as other relevant capabilities that are necessary to implement the activity that you want. Then we want capacity. of the supplier to meet the buyer's current as well as future needs, because in the end you are securing the supplier's consent for strategic items. So you have to determine whether they can satisfy your need currently as well as your needs in the future. And then commitment. You have to determine whether the supplier is committed to quality or is able to achieve the service level that you require to, as well as their commitment to a long-term relationship in dealing with the buying organization. Then you have to ascertain the control systems that the supplier has in place for monitoring and managing resources and risks. For example, you have to determine the willingness of the supplier to comply with procedures, rules, and systems that are required with the buyer. Another example is whether the supplier has control systems for quality or environmental management systems, as well as financial control, risk management, as among others. And then cash. Cash refers to the financial resources or determining the financial status and stability of the supplier. You have to assess their profitability, their cash flow position, whether they have working funds to pay their bills, buy materials, as well as pay their workers. You have to also determine the assets of the supplier, the debt that the supplier owes, how their costs are structured and allocated, and their overall financial health. And then consistency. You have to determine the consistency of the supplier in delivering and improving levels of quality and service. You have to establish, this can be done by establishing or determining the track record of the organization or the supplier in terms of reliability or their process capability, whether they have quality assurance and quality control mechanisms, among others. Then you have to determine how the supplier assesses their costs. That is the price or the whole life cost and value for money that the supplier seeks to offer the buying organization, assuming they are to select them for renegotiation or negotiation. Then compatibility, whether the supplier and their systems as well as personnel and culture are compatible with the buying organization. Then compliance, whether the supplier is willing to comply with environmental standards, corporate social responsibility, sustainable, as well as other legal and regulatory requirements. And then communication efficiency, whether the supplier wants to or seeks to support collaboration and coordination in the supply chain. So information in appraising suppliers using the recast 10Cs. Certain information may not be readily available, so you have to refer to certain sources for information that the organization would use for appraisal, and some of these include appraisal questionnaires that the suppliers will complete. You can access some of the information for appraisal in these questionnaires. You can also access some of the information from financial statement and reports of the supplier, their certification, their quality awards, as well as policy statements. So in the public sector, we all know that the default method is open competitive tendering, which ensures that there is equal access or equal opportunity for everyone without restricting procurement contracts to just a few trusted family members or people who are known. The essence of supplier selection in the public sector is equality and equal access of everything in terms of information as well as opportunities. In supplier appraisals may result from either the organization or the supplying organization asking to be included in an approved supplier list, or the buyer might request the suppliers to be appraised. We should note that in this instance, the second instance, the suppliers might be reluctant, especially in certain circumstances where they do not trust the buying organizations. So we will consider some of the situations that will warrant reluctance from suppliers. So relationship implications of supplier appraisal. In this session, we have reasons why suppliers will be reluctant to be included in supplier appraisal exercises, and this part talks about what a buyer can do to solve such issues. So the supplier might not find the buyer's business attractive, and in this instance, the buyer would have to estimate the likely attractiveness of their business to potential suppliers so as to convince them to avail themselves to the appraisal process. Then there might be possible bad experience with previous appraisals with the buyer or other buyers, and the buyer can or should emphasize that the appraisal process will be carried out fairly and transparently. Suppliers may be unsure of the buying process, perhaps suspecting that some other supplier has an inside track or that the buyer is not serious. And what the buyer can do is that they have to provide full information about how the selection process will work and keep suppliers informed about progress through the various stages. The timing of the proposed appraisal may be inconvenient, and the buyer has to ensure that suppliers have adequate time to prepare for the appraisal. Then suppliers may believe that the process will be expensive and time consuming. And in this instance, the buyer should ensure that the exercise is streamlined and consistent with obtaining the information required without beating about the bush and wasting their time. Suppliers may be wary of sharing confidential information during the appraisal, and the buyer should be prepared to sign a confidentiality agreement so as to assure the suppliers that whatever information they are taking is going to strictly be used for the purposes that has been stated. So after appraisal, buyers are required to provide post-appraisal feedback, as this would help to provide the supplier with helpful information to improve their performance and affect competitiveness. It will also give them some benefit as a return on their investment. It helps to preserve good relations between the buyer and a prospective supplier because of the referrals that the current supplier might give to this prospective supplier. It helps to preserve the buyer's reputation in the supplier market. And after appraisal, you have to give supplier approval, which refers to the recognition that a particular supplier is able to meet the standards and requirements of the particular buyer. And this approval may be for a one-off transaction or that the supplier is put on the approved supplier list. So this session has looked at how new suppliers could be selected, as well as considering supplier appraisal and factors to be considered when appraising suppliers.